Welcome ladies and gents, Chris Andre here. Don't forget to hit a right cross on that subscribe button. Let's talk boxing. We're going to get into controversy once again here on this channel. We're going to talk about the PED scandals that are surrounding Alicia Baumgardner, some of the wild allegations made by Jessica McCASKILL, and we'll talk about whether there's any truth to any of these sorts of allegations that are doing the rounds now. We'll also talk about Conor Benn and that headache that continues to be there for Hearn. Remember, on this channel we like to play the defense and the prosecution. In other words, I give you both sides of an argument and I give you the strong points and the weak points of those arguments. I'll also give you my position and give you the strengths and weaknesses of my own position too. And I let you guys be the jury in the comment section down below. We'll start off discussing Alicia Baumgardner. She had adverse analytical findings on a test that took place on July the 12th, 3 days before her fight against Dartu, and she tested positive for Mesterolone. Now, Mesterolone is one of the oldest anabolic androgenic steroids around. Now, androgenic, as you I'm sure are aware, same root of the word as androgyny, which is the Greek word andras or andros, which essentially means male. So it is a substance that is typically given to men to boost their male hormones. It helps with masculinity, it helps with infertility, it helps with libido if you've got a low libido. It is a medication primarily designed to increase levels of testosterone for men. And from what the various boxing channels that have been interviewing Hearn have been claiming, they've heard that she has 10 times the amount that is typical in a female athlete, a lot more in line with what is typical for a male athlete. So clearly this is a major problem if it is true. Now, Alicia Baumgardner put out a statement, and this statement says, part of it says, the sample provided immediately after my fight on July the 15th tested clean and negative for all banned substances, as did my sample on July the 16th, which was a month earlier, which makes the July 12th result essentially impossible. This is not accurate. Now, this does not mean that she's lying or that she's cheating. What it does mean, though, is that her interpretation of what constitutes a defense is indefensible. It's not correct. It's inaccurate. You see, there's something called a half-life when it comes to drugs. It's the period of time it takes for the volume of the substance that you took into your system to half. So some sources claim that Mesterolone has a 12-hour half-life. In other words, within 24 hours it's out of your system. Others say that it's as long as 2.5 days. So within 5 days it goes out of your system. Let's just say, for argument's sake, to give Alicia the benefit of the doubt, it takes 5 days, okay? Let's say for argument's sake she took an illegal substance 5 days before her July the 12th result. Well, on July the 12th, she may have tested positive. By July the 15th, it's out of her system. So just because you tested negative a month before and you tested negative on July the 15th, it doesn't mean 3 days prior to that you also didn't have anything in your system. Like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean she cheated. It's just that this is not a specific defense. And when I mentioned this on Twitter, by the way, in this discussion, you had Karis Artingstall, a very talented Olympian female boxer, who, of course, they're very used to going through rigorous drugs testing. She liked the tweet. So people understand this. They understand the concept of microdosing and cycling. It doesn't mean that you take big amounts of a substance. You can take small amounts, little micro doses, which can be cycled off quickly. They can come out your system quickly and you still get a benefit from that. And you take masking agents and stuff like that. There's a science that goes behind cheating. They have whole chemists behind them, these drugs cheats. And it's not to say, like I said, that Alicia is cheating. Like I always say, all athletes deserve due process, but that itself is not a defense. Another defense that has come her way is from Jessica McCASKILL, who seems to make a very serious allegation that she only had one fight left on her matchroom contract. They were having some issues when it came to the discussions regarding extension, and then she essentially miraculously failed. And the insinuation is that matchroom may have had something to do with setting her up, framing her, being involved somehow with the laboratory in order to find adverse findings as a punishment. Now, one thing I'll say before we get into this and give you my opinion, like I say, I always play the defense and the prosecution. For those of you who feel that any outlandish allegation, any serious or severe allegation against positions of authority is ludicrous, and you don't even want to give it time of day, you don't want to analyze it, you don't want to consider an allegation, and you stigmatize people as being theorists of a conspiracy, I'll word it like that rather than another way, because we don't want to trigger algorithms on this channel. To be honest, those sorts of people tend to be quite immature when it comes to their critical thinking capabilities. It doesn't mean that every theory of a conspiracy has any weight behind it necessarily, but you also should never just dismiss it, because this idea that people in positions of authority cannot be corrupted simply because they have prestigious positions or because these global organizations might have prestige behind them, it's childlike. And even then, I don't even know if it's a childlike position to take, because even children who watch Disney movies will tell you that conspiracies exist. They'll tell you that Ursula was trying to set up the Little Mermaid. So as an adult, what's your excuse? You see, here's what people tend not to understand. What is a conspiracy? It is a group of people who are in a position of influence or power who come together and constitute a plan that they hide from the rest of the world to benefit themselves. In other words, it's corruption. It's the same thing. And if you don't believe that corruption can exist where there's money to be made and there's powerful people at play, well then, like I said, you are quite immature emotionally and mentally, to be honest with you. Just look at the last couple of days. You've had somebody who was very influential over the last few years who has now taken a job which has shown a real conflict of interest. I'm not going to go into who and what I'm talking about, but we're talking about a real conflict of interest that has come into play. And there's a revolving door, it seems, and this is typical when it comes to that sort of thing. But if you had said this 2-3 years ago, you'd have been laughed out and people would have been saying you're a theorist of a conspiracy. But like I said, it doesn't mean just because these things exist that every allegation has weight behind it. It is often impossible to prove corruption because these people are trying to hide their trail, their tracks. But there's often evidence that you have to pick up on. You can't just make an outlandish claim without any evidence. So where is the evidence for what Jessica McCaskill was saying? If Eddie Hearn genuinely had that sort of influence over the laboratory, and bear in mind, drug-free sport, who we use instead of VADA, according to Eddie Hearn, used the same laboratories in Salt Lake City. So he would have had somebody on the inside at Salt Lake City taking a massive risk to punish Baumgardner for being willing to move to another promotional company. It's a very big jump, a very big assumption to make. And if that's the case, why would that laboratory that VADA used would have found Conor Benn guilty? He's a cash cow for Matchroom. He's important for Matchroom. Wouldn't he have said, listen, sweep this one under the carpet for me? And when they say, yeah, but Chris, you know it was leaked. Yeah, but the report didn't have to come back as being dodgy in the first place. They could have swept that under the carpet. Nobody should have been in a position where they would have been able to leak it because he wouldn't have failed, so to speak, if they wanted to protect him and if he had that sort of influence. That would be what I would venture to suggest. However, like I said, defense and prosecution. There are many people that do believe in weaponized drugs testing. You have people like Fight Film, for instance, who I've not always seen eye to eye with, and he does make some outlandish claims himself, often without basis, but he is also a very intelligent guy and he has done some very good work where he's pointed to certain things where, yeah, you might not be able to prove it, but certain things when it comes to glove tampering, and I'm not talking about Tyson Fury, by the way, when it comes to glove tampering, he's made a really good sort of argument for that. He's an intelligent dude and he believes that weaponized drug testing is common. You've got people like Hatman, for instance, who a number of years ago did a video whereby he was basically saying how he felt that a cash cow is very unlikely to get caught while he's at the peak of his commercial revenue generation. Too many people are benefiting from it. It tends to be athletes that tend to struggle later on in their careers with making money and then they're sort of put on the shelf, or athletes that aren't really generating that much money in the first place. That would suggest that certain promoters have an awful lot of influence. And listen, I can't rule these things out. To give you an example of how a lot of people feel that these things are unjust, when it was the Athens Olympics in 2004, the face of the Greek Olympic team was a guy called Kostas Kenteris and also Katerina Thanu. Now, Kenteris was the 200 meter gold medalist. Thanu was the 110 meter Olympic silver medalist at the hurdles. And I mean, the best Olympian in Greece was Spiros Dimas, who was possibly the best weightlifter of all time. But that wasn't a glamour division, a glamour sport. The track and field athletes that were really shining were those two. And they were called to take a drugs test on one particular evening. And they didn't turn up. They claimed that they had a moped accident. And they provided as evidence this motorbike that had this scuffing and some damage on it. And they said by the time we got to the testers, they had gone. So they wanted to take the test the next morning. It was not accepted, however, and they were essentially thrown out of the competition. They were spoken of as being disgraced athletes. Now, this goes back to the idea of cycling. You know, you may have been dirty the day before and then you're clean now. It doesn't mean you didn't cheat. So we have to get rid of you. And like I said, they were referred to as disgraced athletes. At the time, and I have no idea whether this is true, it could just be paper talk. But at the time, there was a Greek newspaper, I believe it was a local paper in Athens, and it was talking about how there were double standards there because the Olympic basketball team allegedly had a visit from drugs testers at the time. And the security firm that was in charge with their security would not give access to the drugs testers. They claimed they didn't have an appointment, they didn't recognize their IDs or whatever, and that they would have to go back the next day. And that the basketball team were not punished. They were not thrown out of the competition. Now, from what I understand, the way they played it, based on the rumours at the time, is that, look, it had nothing to do with us. We didn't know what the security team were doing. We would have been willing to test. Now, there were a whole bunch of Greeks at the time, locals, and like I said in the newspaper, that were saying, no, that's rubbish. There's a conspiracy going on here because you've got a couple of athletes that could have won medals who were not cash cows. They weren't these internationally acclaimed Nike-sponsored athletes who were going to make an awful lot of money, and that's why they put them on the shelf to enable the creation of new stars so certain people could benefit. Like I said, I'm not saying any of these things are true. I'm trying to explain to you how there are a lot of people that share these sorts of viewpoints. And I can't rule out these things because where money exists, corruption exists. But you need at least some indication of evidence to make these sorts of claims, rather than just McCASKILL coming out, talking randomly, making these outlandish claims, coming out after they're threatened with legal action by Eddie Hearn. He was saying he was going to talk to Rick Ramos, who's a trainer and McCASKILL's partner, I believe, and she gives a half-hearted apology for causing an issue but didn't apologise about her position with Matchroom. Now, a lot of people, Beats for instance, has felt that this is her way of trying to get out of having to deal with Matchroom or the Sandy Ryan fight. He's accused her of having other motives, essentially. I can't possibly know. What I will tell you, though, is that in this specific case, there's nothing there to suggest that. Now, with regards to a lot of people going after Eddie Hearn and saying, how come it's always Matchroom fighters that are popping positive? According to Eddie Hearn, they're doing a lot more testing than any other promotional network. And he has said to them, listen, go and ask these promotional companies and TV networks for every given fight that they're involved in, is there testing for this fight? And start pressuring them, because we're the only ones that are testing at the level that we're testing at. In other words, we're catching guys because we want a clean sport and we're actually funding fair, rigorous testing. Whereas these other guys who are pointing their finger and wagging at Matchroom, they're not testing. Of course, they're not going to catch the same amount of drugs cheats because it's not in their best interest. It would be a conflict of interest for them to catch their own fighters. If what Eddie Hearn is saying true, that they're testing an awful lot more, well, then you have to agree with Eddie Hearn. There has to be a more uniformed approach from all promoters and all networks if they want to weed out drugs cheats. And the fact that there are more being caught with Matchroom doesn't mean that it's only Matchroom fighters that are doing this. Now, with regards to whether somebody is innocent and there's a problem with the testing or whatever, this is why I always say athletes deserve due process. Give them the opportunity to come out, speak, give their opinion. They've been charged with a crime, right? Let them make their case. If after they've made their case, they are still guilty, then fair enough. But give them the opportunity. Now, despite saying that, let me also say that the fact of the matter is there is a massive underreporting when it comes to drugs cheats in the sport of boxing. Something that I've covered in the past. WADA carried out a report and they were considering the sanctioned athletes from retrospective testing where they looked back. There were some pretty remarkable results. In the 2008 Olympic Games, for instance, 7 athletes popped positive for PED use. They kept those samples on record though, and they were analysing the biological profile of athletes moving forward. How did their bodies typically react to different things, different stimuluses over the course of the next 10 years? And as their testing advanced, the methods of testing advanced over the next 10 years, they re-looked at those samples. And 10 years later, they found that a further 65 athletes failed performance-enhancing drugs tests. In other words, they only caught approximately 10% of athletes in real time. It took them 10 years to catch the rest. Only 10%. So bear in mind, an awful lot of athletes out there, boxers included, are going to be cheating. And they're going to be getting away with it. And a lot of them will be sitting there and you'll be thinking, this person's not cheating. A lot of people point to things like physical construct. Look how much more muscular this person looks now. It doesn't always play out like that. You'll get a lot of fat people that fail drugs tests, skinny people that fail drugs tests, because what a drug does and what it's used for varies from athlete to athlete. Some of them want more stamina, more, a faster recovery time. Others want to have more strength. Others want to have more power. Everything is designed for a specific person. Some of them are diuretics. It helps them cut weight so they can be the natural bigger fighter fighting smaller people, right? There are different things. There are certain sports where you have PED use, whereby it enhances your performance by slowing down your abilities and your output when it comes to energy. It calms you down. Things like archery, for instance. You want a steady hand. You don't want your adrenaline pumping the way you might do where it's high octane and physical. So everything is used for what is specific in that moment to help that specific athlete. And there are masking agents, a micro dosing where they know how long it takes before you cycle off it and stuff like that. So they're often a step ahead of the testers because they have whole chemists behind them. So I don't know yet whether Baumgardner intentionally cheated or not. There's been an adverse finding. I wouldn't even put my life on the line that there isn't something dodgy going on when it suits certain people when it comes to weaponized testing and stuff like that. But what I will say is that you cannot just come out and say an outlandish comment without looking at some sort of trail of evidence to back it up. And there's nothing to suggest that Eddie Hearn has framed Alicia Baumgardner as far as I can tell. But moving on from that, one thing that Eddie Hearn certainly can be criticised for, Eddie Hearn had previously claimed that the reason Conor Benn was cleared was because it wasn't down to jurisdiction. It wasn't a case of, okay, this is a VADA test and, UKAD can't make a decision on that. The British Board of Boxing Control only recognised UKAD. He claimed that it wasn't down to jurisdiction. Well, the Mail Sport claimed that the NADP hearing did not include an examination of the science behind how clomiphene was twice found in the fighter's system. And it was actually about jurisdiction. Eddie Hearn was then interviewed and he seemed to claim that it was actually down to jurisdiction more recently, even though at the time he said it wasn't down to jurisdiction. Frank Smith then gave an interview with Boxing News today, and he has said that he can confirm it wasn't down to jurisdiction. So Matchroom either aren't sure what's going on here or there's a bunch of spin going on. But whatever the case might be, the rumours are that UKAD and the British Board of Boxing Control are going to appeal the clearance of Conor Benn. This is a nightmare for Matchroom and the PR of Conor Benn. Now, like I said, we have to be fair. This does not necessarily mean that Conor Benn is guilty, because what they're saying, UKAD and the British Board, is that they've not yet had a chance to analyse the science behind what Conor Benn's team put forward. What they put forward, just to give it to you again as a little summary, is that you can get clomiphene in your system in one of two ways, either via a food source or via a drug. They leave behind different residues from one another. So, for argument's sake, we'll use colours as an analogy. If you ingest it from eggs, it might leave behind a purple residue. If you ingest it from a drug, it might leave behind a green residue. If I therefore analyse Conor Benn's sample and I see that it's completely purple, then I know that it was through eggs genuinely, and it could not possibly have been via a drug. It would make it impossible. That's the presentation that came from the scientific team of Conor Benn, and it's compelling. However, what happens if there's a contrasting scientific team that says, no, what you've said is not scientifically accurate? Or if it was to say, well, actually, 70% of the time what you say is true, but 30% of the time it doesn't apply at all, and you can get this residue from taking it via a drug. Well, now you're going to have to sit there and explain to us where it is that you consumed those eggs in order to add weight to your claim. So it requires analysis. The process continues. So whilst it is true that Conor Benn just can't be cleared willy-nilly, if it's accurate that the NADP did not look at anything involving the science, we also can't yet know for sure whether Conor Benn's scientific team is talking rubbish or not. So the saga continues to play on, but Matchroom continue to try and get it over the line to enable Conor Benn to fight again without him genuinely clearing his name, from what we understand so far, unless it's via a loophole, which is jurisdiction. But Frank Smith has denied that today, and he's saying he can't give more information because of confidentiality. Well, there's going to have to come a point where they agree to start talking publicly, right? Let me know what you think, ladies and gents, about Alicia Baumgardner and Conor Benn, Matchroom and Eddie Hearn. How far along the rabbit hole do you go when it comes to Alicia? Do you think she's been framed? Do you think that Conor Benn is in a position where he's lying to try and get out of something because he's guilty? Or is it just because he's acted, the Matchroom have acted in a certain way which has made him appear guilty, but you expect the scientific findings to back up his argument? Let me know in the comment section down below. Don't forget to hit a stiff jab on the like button, a right cross on the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.